You ever notice how superhero origins just change? One day, Iron Man was injured in Vietnam. The next, it was Afghanistan. Magneto was a Holocaust survivor. But how does that make sense when Marvel insists the X-Men formed just 10 years ago? Something weird is happening with superhero timelines, and it's all because of a secret rule comic book companies don't want you to think about. It's called the sliding time scale, and it's the reason why Spider-Man, Batman, and the X-Men never seem to age, even though the world around them keeps moving forward. But here's the thing. Sometimes this trick breaks down, and when it does, it creates bizarre paradoxes that make no sense. Today we're cracking open this timeline mystery, and once you see how it works, you'll never look at comic books the same way again. So here's the deal. Marvel and DC don't want their characters to age in real time. If they did, Spider-Man, who debuted as a teenager in 1962, would be an 80-year-old man by now. Instead, they use what's called a sliding time scale, where everything in comic book continuity is compressed into a floating 10 to 15 year period. No matter what year it is in the real world, Marvel treats all past events as if they happened only about a decade ago. For example, when the Fantastic Four debuted in 1961, Reed Richards and Ben Grimm were written as World War II veterans. Obviously, if they were still around today, they'd be pushing 100 years old. That doesn't exactly work for a superhero team. So Marvel retconned it, first changing their backstory to the Korean War, then the Vietnam War, then the Gulf War. And now they fought in a vague, never-named modern conflict. The details change, but the timeline stays fresh. Iron Man is another great example. His original origin in 1963 had him injured in Vietnam. That worked at the time because the war was still happening. But as decades passed, Marvel kept pushing the event forward. By the 90s, it was tied to the Gulf War, and in 2008, the MCU version put it in Afghanistan. But here's where things get messy. Some characters have origins that are tied to the real historical events, and as time moves forward, these stories start to fall apart. The biggest example of this is Magneto. His entire motivation as a character comes from surviving the Holocaust. Now that made perfect sense when the X-Men debuted in 1963, because he would have been in his 30s or 40s at the time. But if Marvel insists that the X-Men only started 10 years ago, that would mean Magneto is, over 100 years old now? That math ain't mathin'. Marvel's had to dance around this issue for years. Sometimes they say Magneto's mutant powers slow his aging. Other times they just ignore it. But at some point, they're going to have to rewrite his origin completely, and it's going to look ridiculous. And Magneto isn't the only one. Take Nick Fury. Originally, he was a World War II soldier, but became the head of S.H.I.E.L.D. Obviously, if that was still true, he'd be ancient today. So Marvel found a workaround. They created a new, younger Nick Fury, modeled after Samuel L. Jackson, and wrote the original one out of the main timeline. Spider-Man's had this problem too. When his story first started in the 1960s, his Uncle Ben was said to have fought in World War II. But as the decades passed, that had to change. By the 90s, it was retconned to Vietnam, and today it's usually left vague. But this creates bizarre contradictions, like how Aunt May has been ancient since the 1960s and yet somehow never dies, while Peter Parker barely ages at all. Now, Marvel's solution to all this is constant retconning. They never fully reboot their universe, they just quietly update character histories to fit the modern era. DC, on the other hand, takes a totally different approach. They just hit the reset button. Every few decades, DC reboots their entire continuity, completely wiping out old stories and starting fresh. It happened with Crisis on Infinite Earths in the 80s, then again with the New 52 in 2011, and again with Rebirth in 2016. This allows them to keep Batman and Superman modern, but it also means that fans have had to deal with constant timeline changes. For example, Batman's origin has been rebooted multiple times. In some versions, he's been Batman for 20 years. In others, he's only been around for like 5 years. Superman's origin keeps shifting too. Sometimes he was raised in the classic 1950s Kansas. Other times, he's from a very modern, tech-heavy version of Smallville. It all depends on what DC decides to do after they reset the timeline. So what happens next? Well, as long as Marvel and DC want to keep selling comics, their biggest characters are never going to age in real time. But that also means they're going to have to keep running into historical contradictions. At some point, Magneto can't be a Holocaust survivor anymore. At some point, Peter Parker being a young guy won't make sense. And at some point, they might have to either completely reboot everything or just let some of these characters actually age. Now, sometimes we do get stories that explore what happens when superheroes grow older. Batman Beyond imagines a world where Bruce Wayne is too broken to be Batman anymore and has to pass the mantle to a new generation. Old Man Logan tells the story of a Wolverine who's outlived almost everyone he's ever cared about. And more recently, Chip Zdarsky's Spider-Man Life Story reimagines Peter Parker's life if he actually aged in real time from 1962 until today. growing older, facing the consequences of his choices, and eventually passing the torch. These stories show us what could be, but they're never really part of the main continuity, because for Marvel and DC, the rule is simple. Heroes don't get old, they just get rebooted. But what do you think? Should comic book characters finally age, or do you prefer them staying frozen in time? Let me know in the comments down below. If you love deep dives like this, hit that subscribe button, because next time we're going to be talking about the wildest retcons in comic book history. And remember, with great power comes great comics. So go read them.